Good afternoon, everyone. We are Group 2 from BFSU2A, and we are here to report about Introduction to Ballistics and Gunshot Recipe.
Good afternoon, and we'll start this afternoon with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, come to you in the spirit of learning, humility, and love. We're grateful for this opportunity to learn from each other and grow closer in our faith. Inspire us for your Holy Spirit as we listen and write. Guide us with your eternal light, the knowledge of your truth, love, wisdom, and peace. This is all we pray in the mighty name of Jesus, our Lord. Amen. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and allow me to introduce to you the members of our group. I am Samantha Andrea Mendoza, together with Carmelita Joy Masalungan, Gwyneth Olivar, and Richard Salazar. Okay, so good afternoon, and we will be discussing about the introduction to ballistics, gunshot wounds, gunshot injuries, and ballistics in Philippine settings. The objectives of our report is to gain a scientific understanding of current practice for forensic ballistics and gunshot residue, or GSR examination used within a forensic science context, such as firearms, bullets, bullet holes, bullet trajectories, cartridge cases, and gunshot wounds. To recognize that gun barrels have unique lengths and grooves and these markings leave unique marks, and its guidance to the judiciary in relation to the strengths and limitations of current interpretation and evaluations that can be made. So now, let's proceed with the introduction to ballistics. What do we mean by ballistics? Ballistics is a science that deals with the motion, behavior, and effects of projectiles such as bullets, rockets, and missiles. The word ballistics is derived from the Greek word ballin or ballo, meaning to throw, while forensic ballistics involves the scientific analysis and interpretation of evidence and phenomena related to the legal use of firearms. Now, let's proceed with a brief history. So, yung kauna-unahang documented case ng forensic ballistics is yung case ni Henry Goddard, which occurred in 1835 when the distinctive markings on a bullet taken from a victim were matched with a bullet mold belonging to the suspect. Nagkaroon ng test samples from the suspect's mold, and then he compared it with the casting marks on the recovered projectile, and this allowed Goddard to confirm that the fatal bullet had been produced from the suspect's mold, and later on the suspect was convicted with murder. Next, we have three branches of ballistics. So kindly refer to the illustration para mas maintindihan ninyo yung relationship or yung working mechanism of both internal and external, since this will serve as your key point of firearm identification. First, we have internal ballistics. It is the study of the evidence produced inside the firearm when a bullet or round is fired. Kumbaga dito, pinag-aaralan or kinakalculate yung internal pressure and rate of acceleration from the time na na-struck yung primer sa loob ng firearm para mag-produce ng pressure sa loob hanggang sa mag-exit yung bullet doon sa barrel. Second is external ballistics. It deals with the behavior of the projectile after its exit from the barrel during its flight and makes contact with the target. Meaning, dito naman i-determine or kinakalculate yung range of firing from the time after mag-exit ng projectile or bullet sa muzzle ng firearm until ma-hit niya na yung target. Third is yung terminal ballistics. It's the study of wound ballistics and relates to the behavior and effects of a projectile when it has an impact on the target. Dito naman, ina-identify yung entry and exit points ng bullet sa target or sa katawan ng tao. And kung anong klaseng bullet yung nag-cause ng damage or what we call the gunshot wound. Next, we also have the three basic parts of a modern firearm, which are action, which loads, fires, and ejects ammunition. Second, barrel, a metal tube that the projectile passes through. Third, stock, that supports the action and hold the other parts of a firearm in place. Last is the components of a cartridge. We have primer. It is a friction or impact-sensitive material primarily made up of mercury. It is an explosive chemical compound that ignites the gunpowder when struck by a firing pin. Second, propellant, 2 times gunpowder or smokeless powder. It is a chemical mixture that burns rapidly and converts to an expanding gas when ignited. Modern smokeless powder will burn slowly when ignited in the open or the outside of the case. And third, cartridge case, used to hold the components in place or ito yung pinaka-container. Fourth bullet, the projectile expelled from the barrel, typically made of metal containing lead. So as you can see in the illustration, yung primer is nasa center ng base or ilalim ng cartridge. Then a firing pin will strike the bullet's primer, then the gunpowder will ignite at a very high rate, wherein it creates large volume of gas, kaya magkakaroon ng pressure, and then yung pressure na yon, yung magpo-force sa projectile or bullet palabas sa openings ng barrel and out of the muzzle. So that will be the scope of the report, and allow my other members to discuss and continue the report. Thank you.
So now for the gunshot wounds, my name is Carmelita Joy Masilungan, and I will be discussing more about the gunshot wounds. So gunshot wounds are complex, violent, traumatic injuries commonly encountered in forensic practice. So the study of these injuries is also called wound ballistics. So these injuries are caused by penetration of the body with projectiles ejected from a barrel due to the ignition of gunpowder. In addition to the injury and the projectile, forensic pathologists must have a working knowledge of the flame, gases, smoke, unburned powder, metal scrapings, and grease from the barrel that accompanies the projectile and could become embedded in the surrounding skin or the injury tract. So the injuries caused by the projectile can affect the permanent cavity, the damage the damaged tissues along the path, followed by the projectile as well as the temporary cavity. The tissue surrounding the permanent cavity that is subject to temporary forces, including radial acceleration, stretch, and compression. And in addition, when forensic pathologists will examine a gunshot wound, dapat dinadocument din nila yung type, size, shape, site, and location like any other injury. And also, they are required to investigate and deliberate the cause and manner of the injury, uh, and exit characteristics, the distance and direction of fire, and the vitality of the wound. And gunshot injuries may result in death due to organ damage and wound infection. Next slide. So for the gunshot wounds, there are classifications or types, which is the entry or entrance wound and the exit wound. So the distance and direction of shooting also affect the characteristics of the wound, including the shape, navigation of tissue, the effects of accompanying components including flame, smoke, gas, unburnt particles, metal scraps, and grease. And depending on the direction of the travel of the projectile, these two entry wounds and exit wounds are the types. Next slide. And here are some character are the difference between entry wound and exit wound. So an entry wound does not necessarily correlate with bullet caliber, and the exit wound does not consistently larger it is not consistently larger than entrance wounds. And while entry wound would be smaller, and elastic tissue contracts around wound defect, and on exit wound, skin everted the skin is everted outwards, and there is never any abrasion color or suit or tattooing. And entry wounds are generally smaller and more regular than exit wounds. Entry wounds show a navigation of tissue into the wound, while exit wounds show outward beveling of the tissue. And the skin surrounding the entry wound will show that the these characteristics depending on the distance, the presence of flame burns, soiling and redding from gas, as well as the tattooing from unburned particle and metal scraps. Similarly, the presence of an abrasion rim and grease color around the wound would indicate that it is an entry wound. However, an abrasion rim may also be present on the exit wound where the skin is shored against a hard surface. Exit wounds, in comparison, are larger and more irregular. They show outward beveling of the soft tissue and the margin. Entry wounds will be free of characteristics including flame burns and soiling and redding from gas, as well as tattooing from unburnt particles and metal scraps. They do not have an abrasion rim or grease color except when the skin is shored against a hard surface. Then next is in here I will be showing a picture of an entry wound. So an entry wound of a rifled small arm revolver showing the abrasion color. So note that the location of the injury was over the chest with layers of intervening clothing leading to loss of soiling and tattooing. Therefore, the distance in this case cannot be determined. And then next is the exit wound. So the exit wound from a rifled small arm revolver showing larger injury. So in comparison with the entry wound. And also the injury is irregular in shape with outward beveling of the margin. So that is the difference in terms of uh, it, and that is the difference of entrance and exit wounds. And then the next are the lab tests commonly performed. So physical exam. So physical exam is essential to determining which tests are done. And the CBC type and screen cross are most useful laboratory studies, and additional trauma labs sent per institutional policy, location of injury, and stability of the patient. And then there are X-ray and CT scan. There are X-ray and CT scan performed in order to see or are used in detecting the gunshots. So the first one is the X-ray of the chest or X-ray chest frontal. So as you can see here, there is a moderate to large right pneumothorax with no mediastinal shift appreciated. So there is also a wedge shaped peripherally based opacity within the collapsed mid to upper right lung. Heart size and mediastinal contours are normal. And then the next one is next slide po. And the next one is the X-ray lower leg oblique. And also the next one is the CT chest fascia. So there is a gas in the anterior aspect on the right anterior chest wall and fossa. So so there is a dense radio pack bullet fragment in the right supraclavicular fossa within a number of tiny fragments seen deeper to this, but there is no trauma to the adjacent vessels. So there is at least one small radio-opaque bullet fragment with the right upper lobe pulmonary parenchyma. So the main mass of the bullet fragment measures about 9 millimeter in size and is situated within the middle mediastinum immediately posterior to the upper trachea and medial to the aortic arc. So there is no post-traumatic aneurysm of the aortic arc or descending thoracic aorta. And then next is the chest coronal, and then next as well as the chest sagittal, and then the head axial. So the bullet trajectory traversing both hemisphere is marked by is marked by multiple bullet fragments. So here are some other tests or criteria that are performed or are classified in gunshot wounds. So the first one is the wound classification. So in here, we should be careful classifying entrance and exit wounds kasi most of the time, misclassification and or misclassified are more than 50% performed by surgeons. And in here, what matters is the path of projectile. And if there is only one wound, then it's clearly an entrance wound. And then entrance wounds do not necessarily correlate with bullet caliber, and it may be smaller and elastic tissue contracts around wound defect. And the contact wounds are the weapon in contact with skin. Usually, you can see a burning of skin around wound and you may see a stellate laceration. And for the close range wounds, the weapon is usually 6 to 12 inches from the target and deposited around wound. And for the intermediate range wounds, or short, there you can see a tattooing or stippling around wound, and there is a visible punctuate abrasions from unburned gunpowder. And usually the weapon is less than 60 centimeter from tissue. And for the long distance wounds, you can usually see abrasion color around bullet hole and from friction between bullet and epithelium. And lastly, for the exit wounds, it is not consistently larger than entrance wound, and the skin, just like I've said earlier, is everted outwards, and there is never any abrasion color suit or tattooing. Analysis and interpretation of fatal gunshot wounds is an important and common practice among forensic pathologists. Additionally, the correct interpretation of gunshot wounds by forensic pathologists not only provides valuable information that can assist law enforcement in their investigation, but also it is essential for the final determination of manner of death. The discussion of the practical, basic, and essential skills are required to interpret gunshot wounds, including distinguishing a classic entrance wound from an exit wound, and also recognizing atypical entrance and exit wounds, utilizing the features of suit and stippling patterns of differentiate among contact and close and distant range gunshot wounds, and understanding of the trauma produced by gunshot wounds, and understanding the importance of recovering and documenting or handling any projectiles recovered at an autopsy. Then the next in here are, can a gunshot wound exit be positive for gunshot or gunpowder residue? So the answer is yes. There is a case report where a gunshot wound exit contains gunshot residue. So for the first picture on the next slide, the weapon found, this is the weapon found at the location of the incident of the case. And then on the next slide, you can see that the gunshot residues at the inside of the muzzle is visible when, so automatic kapag gumamit ng barrel, there will be a gunshot residue. And then on the person, on the next slide, so that is the impression or the gunshot entrance wound showing a lacerated wound with black soot visible within the wound and on the wound margins. And on the next slide, there will be an impression of the exit wound during the autopsy. So the first one is the entrance wound, and then this is the exit wound. And since the question is, can a gunshot wound exit be positive for gunshot residue? So on the next slide, you will see that there are gunshot residues uh, found around the exit wound. So yun po yung mga yellow na arrow, yun yung mga gunshot residues. So when a person pulls the trigger on a gun, this causes the firing pin to strike a primer located at the base of the cartridge. So the primer strike in turn sparks a chemical reaction inside the cartridge that ignites the gunpowder, and the resulting explosion propels the bullet out of the barrel of the gun. So the smoke and gas that comes out of the gun along with the bullet typically contains particles of unburnt gunpowder, tiny bits of metal, and signature chemicals from the primer mixture. It is usually lead, antimony, and barium, which get fused together from the heat of the firing and settle on the person's skin, clothing, and other nearby surfaces. So the GSR test detects the presence of these distinctive chemicals, which indicates that the person recently fired a firearm, was in a very close proximity to the gun when it was fired, or came into direct physical contact with the person who did fire it. And for more information about gunshot residues, Ms. Olivar will further discuss about this topic.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Gunat Francine Olivar, and my topic tackles about gunshot residues. Next po. So let us first define what is gunshot residues. Gunshot residues, also called as cartridge discharge residue or firearm discharge residue, are produced due to the burning of powder, rubbing of bullets with fire parts, and explosion of priming compounds. GSR particular may be found on the target, and when the target is human being, they may exist on the body of the victim and on his clothes depending on the range of firing and other factors. It may also be found on hands of the shooter, inside the body of the victim, as well as some distance from the place of firing depending on the firing range. GSR particles may also be found in air. Presence of GSR particles has even been reported in the excreta of the shooter. Next slide po. Spread area of gunpowder residue from a firearm. Majority of GSR will generally travel approximately 3 to 4 meters forward, 1 meter either side, and 1 meter behind the shooter. Ang sinasabi po dito dun sa spread area means how far can a gunpowder travel from a firearm. GSR escapes through weapon openings and can subsequently be deposited on the surfaces in the vicinity of a fired weapon. Anyone within this area might acquire GSR on their person. It might be deposited under their skin, hair, or clothing of the person who has discharged the firearm, on the entrance and the inside on the wound of the victim, or on the target materials at the scene. A recently discharged firearm will also retain GSR on its inner and outer surfaces. This gunshot residue will persist indefinitely until physically removed, or for example, by cleaning. Next slide po. There are two main types of gunshot residue. There are mainly the inorganic and organic gunshot residue. To further classify the two of these, they are differentiate according to formation, sample analysis, and classification. Inorganic gunshot residue is shown to be evidently more significant than organic gunshot residue. The major methods for detection of primary and organic residues are analytical and qualitative. A number of other methods can be used to detect IDCR, such as neutron activation, analysis, and atomic spectroscopy techniques. However, it is universally accepted that scanning electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectrometry, or SEM-EDS, is used in forensic casework. It is a non-destructive technique which provides both morphological, or size and shapes, and elemental information. The SEM's instrument should be capable of detecting particles of approximately 1 micrometer or 1 or over 1,000 of a millimeter in diameter, which are invisible to our naked eye. Analysis by SEN currently provides a highly definitive method by assigning an elemental profile to an individual particle. Currently, it is the most reliable technique for the identification of individual particles consisting of lead, antimony, and barium in various proportions. This combination of elements, along with a morphology indicative of having been produced by a molten process, is commonly accepted as a characteristic of GSR. Let's move on to the organic gunshot residue. Organic gunshot residue is not formed by the firing process. It is mainly originates from propellant powders, firearm lubricants, and some products of their transformation in our hydrocarbons. When sampling for OGCR, wet swabbing with a solvent and vacuuming are the recovery techniques which can be used. Promising early work for organic gunshot residue recoveries and analysis from carbon adhesive stubs has also been achieved, but will require further extensive testing and validation before incorporation into forensic casework. Following sample collection using an organic solvent, such as gas or liquid chromatography, respectively, techniques with mass spectrometry or MS detection are typically used for organic gunshot residue analysis. However, a generic analytical approach for the analysis of organic gunshot residue has not yet been established for routine casework within the international forensic community. Next slide po. Here are some of the chemical tests for gunshot residue identification. In cases wherein a SEM is not available, the test described below can still be used. Excessive caution should be used with the interpretation of any results obtained from these tests, as none of these tests are specific, which means lahat po ng mababanggit na tests are only presumptive tests. The first one is sodium rhodisonate test. Sodium rhodisonate test will react with any barium present to give a red or brown coloration. Alternatively, the filter paper can be spotted with dilute ammonia solution, but this tends to dilute the result, leading to difficulty in identifying the color change. This test can be used for detection of barium, although it is not as sensitive as when used for lead. This test can be used in conjunction with the test of lead, giving a more specific identifier of gunshot residue. The next one is the Walker test for nitrates. This is used for the detection of nitrates in the partially burnt or unburned propellants. And this technique, a photographic paper is desynthesized in hypofixer. Any bright red spots which appears indicates the presence of nitrates compounds. It should be noted that many of other compounds other than nitrocellulose propellants can give a positive reaction, such as urine, paste powder, and fertilizers. The next one is the Leeds test. This is identical to the Walker test except for the main reagent, which is naphthylamine. This reagent gives orange spots, and once again, this test is mainly used for detection of propellant particles in range of firing estimations. The next one, which is the Marshall test, is mainly used for detection of propellant particles in range of firing estimations. A positive indications for nitrites will appear as purple spots on the purple background. It is rinsed in warm water to remove background color, and if rinsed in retinol, the spots will turn orange. Let's move on to the Tewari test. This test is mainly used for range of firing estimations by visualizations of propellant particles. Nitrite compounds will register a positive reaction as deep yellow spots. The next one, which is the lunch reagent, is was the original dermal nitrite test used for proof of firing a weapon. This reagent was sprayed on the paraffin cast of the suspect hands and any nitrite particles present, with, which include nitrocellulose, which would give a deep blue coloration. The problem with this test is that so many everyday chemicals, for example, such as fertilizer, urine, makeup, and etc., can give a positive reaction with this reagent that it is no longer used for the identification of gunshot residues on hands. Harrison and Gilroy reagent, where areas this reagent is really intended for the identification of gunshot residue on hand swabs. It can also be used this as well for range of firing estimations once the particles has been removed from the garment. In this reagent, uncolor orange coloration is positive from antimony, red spots are positive for barium or lead, and purple spots are positive for lead. Lastly, the dithioxamide or DTO test detects copper and nickel and can be utilized for the determination of bullet entry and exit holes for fully executed gilding metal. It can also detect the presence of cobalt, although this is currently of no significance in forensic firearms examination. With DTO, copper produces a very dark green coloration, nickel upping to violet coloration, and cobalt to a brown coloration. The presence of blood, however, can give a false negative result. A dark greenish-gray reaction constitutes a positive reaction for copper, and a blue-violet coloration constitutes a positive reaction for nickel. In addition, the presence of gunshot residue on an individual can be the result of one of the four possible scenarios. 1. The individual has discharged a firearm. 2. The individual has directly handled or been in possession of a firearm. 3. The individual was in the near vicinity of a discharging firearm. And lastly, the individual has been in contact with a surface contaminated with gunshot residue. Next slide po. Next po. Here's an example of a particle image of a gunshot residue from a SEM analysis. Next slide. In correlation with gunshot residue analysis, shooting distance determination is used to determine the relative position and proximity of the firearm and the victim at the time when the firearm goes off. During the course of a shooting investigation, there may be at least two issues to consider. One is who shot the firearm and how far was the shooter from the victim when the shot was fired. The answer to these questions actually involve the analysis from two separate lab disciplines. To determine who may have been shot the firearm, the tree section performs gunshot residue analysis as we discussed earlier. And to figure out how far the shooter may have been from the victim, the firearm section performs shooting distance determinations. Shooting distance determination are performed in an attempt to approximate firearm nozzle to target distance or range at the time of the suspect firearm being discharged. These are possible because burnt and unburnt gunpowder particles along with the bullets are discharged from the muzzle, which are then impact clothing or other items. Single or multiple protective firearm residues may leave a pattern on the victim's outermost garment or another surface, such as a wall. Clothing and other surfaces may be analyzed to ascertain an appropriate muzzle to target range. In theory, the closer a discharged firearm to is an object, the smaller the gunpowder pattern will be. Likewise, the more distance, the larger the gunpowder pattern. In summary po, it pertains that pag mas malapit daw po yung firearm to an object, mas smaller daw po yung pattern na makikita, yung gunpowder pattern na makikita. On the other hand, the more distance, the larger the gunpowder pattern will show. Next slide. This is the example of the distance determination analysis. Next slide. Bullet 1. A hole in a garment or object can be chemically processed for the lead and copper residues, which may be indicative of a bullet passage. A ring of residue wiped from the surface of the bullet as its processing material is common around the immediate parameter of a bullet entrance. The ring appears very dark on lighter materials. When a firearm is discharged at a close distance or in contact with a garment, telltale physical characteristics may be present, which include melting of entrance holes, immediate parameter, an obvious soot or vaporous cloud on the outer parameter, and or a very irregular hole, just as shown as the picture. Next slide, po. This time we will tackle shot pattern examples. Shot pattern determination depends on the shotgun barrel's configurations and scope, as well as the type of shot shell and its components, such as size, number of pellets, and wadding. In theory, the closer a gunshot is discharged to an object, the smaller its pellet pattern will be. The more distant, the larger the pellet pattern. Next slide. Close and contact gunshots on clothing. When a firearm is discharged at a close distance or in contact with the victim, there may be a physical characteristics present on the victim's garment, such as melting of the entrance holes, immediate parameter, obvious soot, and vaporous clouds on the outer perimeter and are irregular. Next slide, po. Gunshot pattern before and after chemical processing. When a firearm is discharged at a close distance or in contact with the victim, their gunshot patterns are chemically developed prior to analysis. This left photo demonstrates a gunshot pattern prior to processing, while the right photo demonstrates the gunshot pattern after chemical processing. Next slide, po. Current practice of determining gunpowder residue worldwide in PNP Manila. Research and advancements in technology have brought changes to gunshot residue examination over the past several years. While the final report on particle analysis for gunshot residue dissection, released in 1997, still stands as an excellent comprehensive report on the analysis and interpretation of gunshot residue. Still stands as an excellent comprehensive report on the analysis and interpretation of primer gunshot residue. Additional research and development have led to improvements and refinements in how authorities detect gunshot residue. One particle analysis by scanning electron microscopy, energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, or STM-PDS has become the preferred method of analysis over both techniques such as atomic absorption, because STM-PDS provides increased specificity as well as ability to conduct analysis without chemicals. Recently, technological advances have made particle analysis quicker and easier, but most current research involves the interpretation of the results. That concludes my part of the report, and now Yushan Salazar will now introduce the ballistics in the PH settings. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rachel Salazar, and I am here to report about ballistics in the Philippine settings. To start, I will be discussing about one of the famous ballistic case here in the Philippines, which started on 1995, the Ensign Pestaño case. For a short introduction, so he is Ensign Philip Andrew Pestaño. He worked for 2 years as a cargo and deck officer of the Navy ship at BRP Bacolod City until he died on September 27, 1995. So the Navy claimed that it was a case of suicide, but his family insisted that it was a case of murder. Okay, so ito po yung crime scene kung saan namatay si Pestaño. Ito yung stateroom niya. So for the timeline of the case, I will be discussing the events, chronological order of the events, kung anong nangyari sa kaso. On or about September 25, 1995, the ship's commander permitted the loading of more than 14,000 board feet of logs onto the BRP Bacolod City without proper papers or authorization. Philip vehemently objected to the loading of such unauthorized cargoes. On September 26, 1995, Philip's parents received an anonymous phone call warning them that their son's life was in danger. So dahil sa takot, pinuntahan nila si Philip on the same day sa Navy Station located at Sangley Point, Cavite City, about 100 kilometers away from Manila. And they took him to their house in Loyola Heights, Quezon City. That night, the victim disclosed to his father that the BRP Bacolod City ship was doing illegal or dirty acts, and that the illegal cargo included 20 sacks of shabu worth approximately 1 billion pesos in the black market. Now, his father was actually the Philippines Navy's biggest ship repair contractor, and so he was afraid na baka jeopardize yung kanilang business. So, in-advise niya sa kanyang anak na huwag na lang ituloy or i-pursue yung pag-iimbestiga sa kaso ng ship. But Philip was determined to take the matter forward. And so, on the next day, September 27, at about 4 a.m., he left the family's home and proceeded to board his ship to, sabi ng father, is to retrieve his organizer na naglalaman ng mga pangalan and mga events na naitala niya about doon sa case na yun. But at about 11 a.m. on the same day, the authors received a call from the Philippine Navy asking them to proceed to the Navy headquarters in Manila because their son Philip had an accident. When they arrived, they were prevented from entering their son's stateroom where he lay dead. And instead, they were immediately asked to sign an authorization for an autopsy to be conducted on their son's body, to which the authors consented after having viewed their son's body. So they insisted na makita talaga yung katawan ni Pestaño bago mag-sign ng authorization for an autopsy. And doon nila napansin na yung safe na pinaglalagyan ng organizer na dapat ay kukuhanin ni Pestaño ay bukas na, and yung organizer ay wala na doon sa stateroom ni Pestaño. And the Navy thereafter exhibited an alleged suicide weapon and an alleged suicide note in support of their position that the author's son had committed suicide. Now, yung suicide note na sinasabi ay napansin nung father ni Pestaño na hindi tugma sa sulat ng kanilang anak. Kaya doon na sila naghinala na baka murder yung kaso. On September 30, 1995, Philip was buried in the National Cemetery for military personnel and given full military honors, despite a Navy policy stating that suicide victims should not benefit from such treatment. So after yung kaso or yung event na nangyari yun, 3 opisyal pa ng Navy ang namatay or nawala in relation to BRP Bacolod City. In October 1995, the radio operator of the BRP Bacolod City during its Mindanao voyage and a close friend of Philip drowned in high seas under highly suspicious circumstances during an alleged mission where all his companions survived, and until now, the victim's body was never found. The second one, in November 1995, another member of the Navy who was perceived as an ally of Philip and who was also aboard the BRP Bacolod City in September 1995, mysteriously disappeared after being ordered to report to the Navy headquarters in Manila, and this is PO2 Josimo Villanueva. Lastly, we have in January 1996, another member of the Philippine Navy mysteriously died, that is Ensign Alvin Parone. He died in a military hospital after a strange and quick deterioration of his condition. This person was suspected of involvement in the Cebu operation in the BRP Bacolod City, as well as in the death of Philip. And he had engaged in discreet talks with Philip's family before his death. He was believed to be ready to reveal important information before he died. On January 2, 1996, Philip's parents received a leaked copy of an intelligence report of the state party's armed forces, which stated that the BRP Bacolod City carried 1 billion pesos worth of shabu in 20 sacks of rice during its September trip. The report also indicated that this shipment had been escorted by a security officer of the state party's Navy flag officer in command, and that upon discovering the illegal cargo, Philip had confronted his superior and was killed afterwards to prevent him from revealing the criminal activities taking place on board the ship. On August 5, 1997, the Philippine National Police Criminal Investigation and Detection Group, or the PNP-CIDG, said that their investigation showed Pestaño committed suicide, concurring with initial findings of the Western Police District and National Bureau of Investigation. And on January 29, 1998, the Senate investigated the case and concluded that Pestaño did not commit suicide as it appeared, but was murdered. So there were already a lot of investigation happening, but contradicting sa isa't isa. On May 2, 2000, the Ombudsman in charge of the file dismissed the case without prejudice, concluding in its evaluation report that the conduct of further investigation in order to find out the identity of the perpetrator and his accomplices, if any, will only be a waste of time, considering that the physical evidence has already been tampered with, not to mention the lapse of time. But upon the retirement of the Ombudsman and the appointment of his successor, Philip's parents filed a new complaint with the Office of the Ombudsman. And on October 2005, Ombudsman Simeon Marcelo found merit in the petition, reopened the case, and requested from the commanding officer of the BRP Bacolod City to submit counter affidavits as respondents within 10 days. But only 1 week after reopening the case, the Ombudsman stepped down and was replaced. On May 11, 2010, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights released its findings concluding that Pestaño was murdered. The findings came following the appeal of Pestaño's parents, Felipe and Evelyn, urging the international body to solve the case. Now, after this, yung na-involved na ang United Nations, dun pa lang na-urge ang Philippine government to actually solve the case faster. And noong May 17, 2010, overall Deputy Ombudsman Orlando Casimiro approved the recommendations of its investigators that criminal charges be dismissed for insufficiency of evidence. So walang pa yung evidence talaga nila, kaya hindi nila nga ituloy yung kaso. January 11, 2012, the Office of the Ombudsman under former Supreme Court Justice Conchita Carpio Morales filed murder charges against 10 officials and officers of the Philippine Navy in connection with the death of Pestaño. Morales reversed the earlier dismissal of the Ombudsman, saying there is sufficient evidence to file charges against the officials. It was actually initially sent before the Sandigan Bayan, but was later transferred to the Manila Regional Trial Court, or the MRTC. This is because of Section 4 ng Presidential Decree 1606, which states that Sandigan Bayan shall exercise original jurisdiction in all cases involving Philippine Army and Air Force colonels, naval captains, and all officers of higher rank, which means na walang jurisdiction ang Sandigan Bayan sa case na to, kaya nalipat sa MRTC. And according sa report ng MRTC investigation, ito talaga ay isang murder, but kulang sila sa evidence para mapatunayan na yung 10 official ay sadyang nag-conspire to kill or to murder Pestaño. The evidence, physical evidence, and circumstantial evidence will be discussed later. So year, I think 2021, when the Supreme Court made their final decision, which is to clear the Navy officers of gross misconduct. The first division ruled that Morales violated the Ombudsman Internal Rule, Section 7 of the Rules of Procedure, that if the respondent is absolved of the charge, the decision shall become final and executory. Since meron na nga nagawang desisyon ng Ombudsman yung sinundan ng Morales na inabsolve yung case ni Pestaño, yun na daw yung final and executory decision. The Navy men insisted that Casimiro's decision absolving them in 2009 had become final, but Morales argued that absolving means declaring them innocent, which according to her, Casimiro did not do. She also said that the administrative case was just dismissed based on insufficiency of evidence, but the court stated, quoted unquote, even assuming that the records indicate the existence of a felonious scheme, the administrative liability of a person allegedly involved in such scheme cannot be established through conspiracy, considering that one's administrative liability is separate and distinct from penal liability. Now we will go to the physical evidences which actually supports the claim of Pestaño's family. First, we have the cabin wall had a lone blood smear, but no blood splatters, bone fragments, or human tissues were found in Pestaño's 9x10 pit room, which would have actually happened if he indeed shot himself in close range. Second physical evidence, blotches of blood on the pillow and on the bed were inconsistent with the suicide claim. Also, there is one forensic investigator na nagsabi that the blood patterns could have actually been made after Pestaño was laid on the bed, and that he could have been possibly shot elsewhere or not in his stateroom. Next, a bullet mark on the steel wall between the closet and the main door suggested an elaborate conspiracy to make it appear Pestaño committed suicide. Also, one crucial physical evidence is the result of the autopsy report. There were two contusions on the right temporal region of Pestaño and Pestaño, and there's also a laceration on his left ear, which both were not from bullet but from a blunt object. But this is according to an American forensic investigator na kinontradict naman ni Dr. Raquel Fortun. We all know her. Isa rin siya sa nag-investigate or sa forensic investigator that time, and she said sa isang interview noon sa UP College of Medicine na she's been consistent since 1995 na sadyang suicide yung kaso ni Pestaño. Quoted and quote, she said, "I said the evidence pointed to a suicide and I'm still saying the same thing. There's nothing new that has come up. It's the same. It's just that they are now twisting the interpretation of the findings." But when she gave her report, she said Pestaño's parents rejected it because they already had a conclusion and that she was retained to prove that it was not a suicide. She also stated that the ombudsman did not cite any new evidence but rehashed the interpretation given by an American expert hired by the Pestaño family to say what they want to hear. So eventually, hindi tinanggap ng family ni Pestaño yung report na binigay ni Dr. Fortun, hence they hired another American expert to investigate their case. And Fortun, who has kept a file folder on the Pestaño case, said the facts were misinterpreted by Hill, who she said was not a forensic pathologist. And according to Fortun, the two contusions that were a centimeter from the bullet hole and the ear laceration were related to the gunshot wound. This is what she verbatimly said. Based on the mechanisms of how a bullet destroys tissue, the contusion is what is called a muzzle imprint. This is an example of a muzzle imprint. And then the injury near the bullet exit near the ear, that is what you call a laceration. That is probably from the gases of the bullet exit. But against Fortun's lone testimony, Bagares, which is Pestaño's family's lawyer, said that 4 medico-legal experts and 2 ballistics experts trained by the U.S. Federal Bureau of Investigation agreed that Pestaño's death was not a suicide and that there was a foul play which happened. And one physical evidence then po is the suicide note, which was proven to not be a match with Castaño's handwriting. So for the circumstantial evidence, this one is one of the crucial circumstantial evidence which was found actually noong 1996 siya, pero natagpuan siya way back 2006, so naitago. On January 1996, a report by AFP General rejected the suicide theory, also taking note of the deviation in the ship's sailing pattern, which took a dog-legged route instead of its regular direct route from Sangley Point in Cavite to the Navy headquarters in Rojas Boulevard. The usual trip would actually take about 45 minutes, but on September 27, the BRP Bacolod took 2 hours before it reached the headquarters. This report has been kept under wraps by the AFP top ranks and was made available to complainants only sometime in 2006, which also recommended that certain Navy personnel be investigated for culpability in Castaño's case. Okay, so this recommendation was actually acted upon, pero sobrang tagal na. The compelling new evidence allowed his family to go to the UN High Commissioner in Human Rights in 2007. And ayan. In addition, noong 2014, meron talagang humarap sa Manila RTC na witness, and si Samiran, na siya yung investigator, nag-investigate siya September 28 to 29, 1995, after ng case. And sabi niya, kinausap niya ng 1 hour yung mga officers na nandun. And may isa na umamin na sangkot sa pagpatay. Pero ini-threaten siya na huwag sabihin yung mga info na binigay sa kanya kasi may mangyayaring masama. And then, natakot siya. Tapos nung time na ready na siya sanang umamin, nagka-stroke naman siya, so he wasn't able to disclose the information in public. Ayan. So, addition, yung sa physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, in addition, is the use of a gun, which is hindi kay Castaño. So, yung ginamit niyang gun sa pag-suicide ay hindi kanyang gun, kundi dun sa isa niyang kasama, si respondent accused. So, yun yung isa sa question kung bakit kailangan niyang gumamit ng gun na iba kung meron naman siyang sariling gun. Okay, so that concludes my report about Ensign Castaño case. Let's now proceed to the paraffin test, application of paraffin test in the Philippines. Okay, so paraffin test was originally known as the dermal nitrate test devised by Teodoro Gonzalez of the Mexico City Police Department in 1933. This procedure involves the coating of a person's hand with molten paraffin wax, and once it cools, the casts are removed so that the chemical diphenylamine acid can be applied. The chemical basis of the test is premised on the presence of nitrates and nitrites that will react to produce a visible blue-violet color change on the wax. Okay, so Fortune made a study which she presented in 1966 at the 18th annual meeting of American Academy of Forensic Science. She documented how the paraffin test failed to differentiate people who fired guns against those who didn't. She said that the PNP should utilize more sensitive tests as against the traditional paraffin test, since the method cannot really determine miscreants aside from torturing the subject by having both his or her hands placed in a molten paraffin wax. So until today kasi ang ginagamit pa rin ng ating PNP and law enforcers ay ang paraffin wax, which is hindi na naman talaga ginagamit sa ibang bansa. Matagal na lang hindi ginagamit kasi meron ng mga modern scientific methods na ginagamit. So the nitrates and nitrites are believed to have come from the gunpowder or primer inside the bullet casing that ignites as a gun is fired. And Dr. Fortune explained that the soil, water, food, chemicals, and other materials also have nitrates and nitrites, which means that false positive results of the test are highly likely. So, hindi talaga reliable ang paraffin test sa ngayon na. The supposed positive blue reaction is also very unreliable, Fortin said, noting that a permanent documentation of this color change is practically not possible because it disappears fast and requires magnification. So, hindi natin mapagkakaila ngayon na wala talaga sa top priority ng Philippine government and Philippine law enforcement ang forensic. But noong unti-unting nababago naman ngayon kasi na-approve na yung House Bill number 417 entitled An Act Establishing the Forensic Science Institute in the University of the Philippines System, defining its functions and appropriating funds therefore, which is authored by Representative Evelina Escudero, the first district representative from Sorsogon. Okay, so the House Committee on Higher and Technical Education, chaired by Representative Ann Hofer, approved a bill which seeks to create a Forensic Science Institute, or FSI, in the University of the Philippines. In her sponsorship speech, Escudero said she re-sponsored the bill which was refiled in the 15th Congress because of the recent case on DNA testing involving the killing of Kian Lloyd de los Santos. One of the objectives of the proposal is to promote research and development in the various fields of forensic science and advance the research for truth. Another is to enhance the competencies and capabilities of existing laboratories in the country and prepare them for accreditation. Likewise, it aims to develop a corps of professionals to prepare them for a career in forensic science and to train and upgrade technical, scientific, and management skills of personnel presently involved in the forensic science so as to improve the administration of justice. Among the functions of this FSI are to provide competent, scientific, and advanced medical and technical services for the detection and investigation of crimes, maintain a network of modern laboratories for the development and adoption of analytical methods and procedures related to forensic evidence, as well as to undertake research in all fields of forensic science, among other things. With regard to funding, 300 million pesos shall be appropriated out of any fund in the National Treasury not otherwise appropriated to carry out the objectives and provisions of the law from the date of its effectivity until the following fiscal year. Now, one of the resource persons, Dr. Fortune, College of Medicine professor, said she is familiar with the initiative to establish a Forensic Science Institute. And she asked if the said bill is the same as the one authored by former Representative Gilbert Teodoro because she knows its history. She said, quoted unquote, "I was part of the drafting. I know the history. It was Rep. Teodoro who first came up with the idea of having an independent academic forensic institute." Fortune said that the UP Board of Regents had actually approved the Forensic Science Institute all the way back during the time of UP President Emil Javier, but it never took off. What I know is that it's already in place. It has not been repealed. It's there, but it has not been implemented yet. Hofer then asked if there will be no duplication of functions between the PNP Crime Laboratory and the Forensic Science Institute. Then Police Chief Inspector Lorna Santos said that the PNP welcomes the creation of FSI in a university because there is limited access to the discipline in terms of getting an academic degree in forensic science. And she also stated that as to duplication, the way we see it, there is a duplication of function of the crime lab. We have existing forensic laboratories in the Philippines, Santos explained, but this was countered by Escudero, and she said that it will actually enhance what you are doing because we are going to train professionals for this particular science. And the reason why we are having this bill is to provide appropriate funding for this particular institute kasi wala pong pondo as of now. But a lot of experts here in the Philippines are actually suggesting na huwag sa Manila i-base ang Forensic Institute since masyado ng congested, nandoon yung mga main centers or agents ng ating law enforcement. So they're suggesting na sa mga karatig probinsya or cities na lang ilagay ang Forensic Institute like in Batangas. That concludes my report. So here's the summary of our report. For the branches of ballistics, we have internal ballistics, external ballistics, and terminal ballistics. There are three basic parts of a modern firearm, which are action, barrel, and stock. And there are four components of a cartridge. Main components are the primer, propellant, which have two types, the gunpowder or the smokeless powder, the cartridge case, and the bullet. For the gunshot wounds, these are caused by penetration of the body with projectiles ejected from a barrel due to the ignition of gunpowder. Gunshot wounds, there are two types, the entrance and the exit wounds. And for the GSR or the gunshot residue, there are also two types, the inorganic and the organic. Okay, so we also discussed about the Ensign Pestaño case, the Pestaño versus the Philippines, wherein it came to the final verdict of the Supreme Court having cleared the 8 personnels of their grave misconduct. Then we also discussed about the paraffin test, how unreliable it is, and how it has been abandoned by the law enforcement agencies all over the world. And the Forensic Institute in the House Bill 417 entitled an act establishing the Forensic Science Institute in the University of the Philippines system, defining its functions and appropriating funds therefore. Thank you. And these are the references for our report.